Hi there everyone, Mychal A. Bryan here from the Oraculos School of Astrology, and today we're diving into the topic of essential dignities and debilities in traditional astrology. Now, this topic, essential dignities and debilities, is something very important for us to learn at the beginning of our journey with traditional astrology, and this is the parts of why it is such a cornerstone part of the education that we offer within the first semester of our Professional Astrologers Diploma program. When we refer to essential dignities, we're referring to anything that strengthens or fortifies the essence of a planet. When we refer to the essence of a planet, we're referring to who that planet is within its deepest interiority. Therefore, the things that fortify or that dignify the essence of that planet are going to be factors that aid that planet's overall functioning in general. Now, it's very important for us to distinguish between the words fortification and dignity within traditional astrology. Because today we oftentimes hear people talking about accidental dignities and debilities, as well as essential dignities and debilities. However, classically speaking, the term dignity was only reserved for essential dignity. And when we're referring to things that accidentally or environmentally strengthen a planet, we call those things fortitudes. Therefore, from the perspective of traditional astrology, we do not have accidental dignities. A planet isn't accidentally dignified by being in the first house. A planet is accidentally fortified by being in the first house, whereas that same planet could be accidentally dignified because it is in a sign that it calls its home in general. I've written about this topic extensively in my first book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, A Depth of Beginning in the Celestial Art, where I go into far greater detail on this topic of essential dignities and debilities. But in a nutshell, when we refer to essential dignities, we're referring to signs of the zodiac in which the planets have varying levels of strength. And from a traditional perspective, there are 5 essential dignities: domicile, exaltation, triplicity, term, which is also known as bound, and face, which some people also refer to as the decan or the decanate. There is a traditional scheme of applying points to planets when they are essentially dignified, and that traditional scheme gives 5 points to a planet when it is residing in its own celestial house, also known as its domicile, 4 points to a planet when it is residing within its exaltation, 3 points to a planet when it is in its own triplicity, 2 points to a planet when it is in its own term/bound, and 1 point to a planet when it is in its own face/decan/decanate. This points system is a rudimentary way of assessing the strength of a planet for raw beginner students in astrology. The further up the astrological food chain we go, we find ourselves simply speaking about the planets themselves and the things that are strengthening them and the things that are weakening them. And to that end, we don't usually think in terms of 5 points because it's in its domicile, 3 points because it's in its triplicity. When we're actually practicing astrology, we're thinking more in terms of the organic realities of the chart with which we're presented. Now, it's important for us to know that all levels of essential dignity are referred to as rulership. Therefore, a planet that is in its domicile isn't just in its domicile, it is in its domicile rulership. Or rather, that planet has domicile rulership in that particular sign. For example, the moon has domicile rulership in the sign of Cancer because Cancer is the domicile of the moon. Similarly, Jupiter has exaltation rulership in Cancer because Jupiter is the exaltation ruler of Cancer. In a daytime chart, Venus has triplicity rulership in Cancer because Venus is the daytime triplicity ruler for all the water signs. Mars is the triplicity ruler for water signs in the nighttime chart, and the moon is also having triplicity rulership in Cancer because the moon is also the participating triplicity ruler of all of the water signs, even though she is also the domicile ruler of Cancer. Mars has term rulership within the first 6 degrees of Cancer. And finally, as far as Cancer is concerned, we have Venus ruling the first 10 degrees of Cancer, Mercury ruling the second 10 degrees of Cancer by face rulership, and finally the moon ruling the final 10 degrees of Cancer by face rulership. So as we can see, this term rulership doesn't just belong to the planet that is the domicile ruler of a sign, but the term rulership extends to all of these other areas in which a planet has dominion either over the entire sign or over a section of the sign. The reason why I think this is important is because in modern astrology, we tend to speak specifically in terms of ruler. So we tend to say that the moon is the ruler of Cancer, and Jupiter is the ruler of Sagittarius and Pisces, and Saturn is the ruler of Aquarius and Capricorn. But what type of ruler? As we can see, using the term ruler is really not the best term in the world for us to be using, because the term ruler within traditional astrology refers to all 5 levels of essential dignity rulership, and it does not only apply to the planet that is the domicile ruler of the specific sign in question. Now, as far as essential debility is concerned, we have 3 levels of essential debility. We have detriment, fall, and peregrination. We know that detriment is the opposite of domicile. Therefore, we have Saturn finding his detriment in the signs of the luminaries, and the luminaries are also in their detriment in the signs of Saturn, with the moon being in her detriment in Capricorn and the sun being in his detriment in Aquarius. We have Jupiter is in his detriment in both the signs of Gemini and Virgo, and Mercury is in his detriment both in the signs of Sagittarius and Pisces. We have Mars being in his detriment in the signs of Venus, Taurus, and Libra, and we have Venus being in her detriment in the signs of Mars, Aries, and Scorpio. Then we have the essential debility of fall. And when a planet is in its fall, it is in the sign that is opposite to its sign of exaltation. Therefore, we know that Saturn has his exaltation in Libra, and Saturn is in his fall in Aries. Jupiter has his exaltation in Cancer, and Jupiter is in his fall in Capricorn. Mars has his exaltation in Capricorn, and Mars is in his fall in Cancer. The Sun has his exaltation in Aries, and the Sun is in his fall in Libra. Venus has her exaltation in Pisces, and Venus is in her fall in Virgo. Mercury has his exaltation in Virgo, and Mercury also has his fall in Pisces. And this is the only place within the entire essential dignities and debilities schema where we find that a planet that is having its exaltation in one sign can also have its domicile in that same sign. And similarly, if a planet is having its fall in one sign, it can also have its detriment in that sign. This only applies to Mercury because to a very large degree, many of the secrets and the esoteric wisdom within our Western traditional astrology is held within the mysteries of Mercury. So here we see yet another place within traditional astrology where mysterious Mercury has a set of circumstances that only applies to him, because Mercury is the only planet who has both his domicile and exaltation in the same sign and his detriment and fall in the same sign. And finally, we have the moon having her exaltation in Taurus and her fall in Scorpio. So these are the major essential dignities and debilities. Now, there's another state that a planet can find itself in when it is in a particular sign of the zodiac, and that state is known as peregrination. Peregrination essentially is a fancy word that means to be lost, to be confused, to be somewhere where you don't understand the culture and the culture also doesn't understand you. To be peregrine is to be a foreigner in a foreign land, essentially, that doesn't even give you the courtesy of communicating with you in a way that you can understand, because perhaps there's even a language barrier there as well. This is the idea of peregrination. At the moment, I'm watching Outlander, which is one of my favorite series in the world. And in the Outlander series, the main character, Claire, finds herself in the middle of 18th century Scotland, basically. And while there, a lot of the Scottish people, they speak to her, or rather, they speak around her using their native tongue of Gaelic, and they don't actually speak in a way that she can understand because she's essentially an outlander and an outsider. And in one episode, she describes how she wasn't even annoyed by the circumstances of finding herself as a 20th century woman in the 18th century. She was annoyed and frustrated by the ways in which they use their language to make her feel even more isolated, and the ways in which they use their language to make her feel even more of a person who was rejected within their community. And that's essentially the same sort of energy that we find around the planet when that planet is in a state of peregrination. Because when we're peregrine, it means we don't have a center of gravity, we don't have a sense of direction, and we are absolutely and utterly lost within the world. This is our understanding of the word peregrination. And the planet is peregrine when that planet finds itself in a sign of the zodiac where it does not have domicile, exaltation, triplicity, term, face. I extend this further, and not all of my colleagues agree with me on this, but I extend this further to say that that planet also doesn't have detriment in that sign or fall in that sign. So a lot of my colleagues will say that a planet is in its detriment as well as peregrine. Whereas for me, if you're in your detriment, you don't also need to slap on peregrination on the top of that, because the detriment itself is a sufficient enough essential debility to cause some level of stress in relationship to the things that that planet rules and signifies, without us adding another layer of something else. Similarly, some people say, oh, this planet is in its fall as well as peregrine. Whereas for me, that feels like a little bit too much. It's sufficient for us to say that the planet is in its fall without also slapping on the peregrination on top of it. So I only refer to a planet as being truly peregrine when that planet is not in its domicile, detriment, exaltation, fall, triplicity, term, or face. At that point, we can define the planet, as far as I'm concerned, as truly being peregrine, even though not everybody is of opinion. So those are our levels of essential dignity and stability. Now, the next thing to ask ourselves is, what do these levels mean? The ancients tell us that when a planet is in its domicile or its celestial house, like Mars in Aries and Scorpio and Venus in Taurus and Libra, when a planet is in its domicile, it is like a king within its castle. That planet has agency and freedom and so much ability to do anything that planet desires to do within this lifetime. That planet is well situated from an essential dignities perspective to be successful in all of its endeavors. When a planet is in its exaltation, the ancients tell us that this is akin to a proud and haughty man who is assuming more of himself than is his rightful due. Therefore, when a planet is in its exaltation, that planet can oftentimes have a very large ego or a very large sense of who that planet is within the context of the chart in general, and that planet may assume that it is capable of doing things that it really doesn't have the range or the potential to actually accomplish. So that is exaltation. It seems like it should be stronger than domicile. However, exaltation is most definitely weaker than domicile. One of the things that I oftentimes do when it comes to this sort of exercise at Oraculos is I ask my students to think about a person who in their life they know is just in their domicile. Who is a person who you know in your life is operating from a place of their deepest power? Because when we can associate the planets with those people, we can also begin to understand these astrological concepts in a deeper way. Because the reality is, astrology is no one's first language. All of us have to learn astrology secondhand. Therefore, it's very important for us to find ways to make our astrology feel more deeply integrated into the fabric of our larger life. So, as far as essential dignity and debility is concerned, think about somebody who you know who is in their domicile, operating from their power, so that when you are asked or put on the spot to describe what it means for a planet to be in its domicile, you have the ability to speak about that because you have the ability to actually draw on your memories of that person who you know. Another piece is, similarly, think about a person who seems proud and haughty to you, who assumes more of themselves than is their rightful due, who feels as if they can do anything, accomplish anything, be anything, go anywhere, because they just feel as if there's so much wind behind their back, whether or not it's true. Think about that person and let that person be who you consider when you think about a planet in its exaltation. A planet in its triplicity is a planet that is so-so. When we say a planet is so-so, we mean that planet is kind of doing well, but it's also kind of not doing well. And in the process of it kind of doing well and kind of not doing well, it just finds itself in the middle, where it is foundationally able to take care of itself, but it doesn't really have the tools necessary to take care of itself in a very robust way. And we know people like this within our lives, people who tend to always be middling, people who are always having something to complain about, even though in general their life seems to be okay. We all know these people who just live life in the middle, and they don't have any sharp spikes to take them closer to success, but neither do they have any deep dips that take them further away from success. They're simply living in the middle of whatever their truth is. Then next we have essential dignity by term or bound. When a planet is in its term/bound, one of the things that we need to know is that that planet doesn't necessarily have any great level of strength per se. However, when a planet is in its term/bound, that planet has the ability to be more like itself. Therefore, we know that Venus, for example, is in her detriment in the entire sign of Aries. However, within that same Aries, we have Jupiter ruling up to the 6th degree of Aries, then Venus ruling up to the 14th degree of Aries, then Mercury ruling up to the 21st degree of Aries, then Mars ruling up until the 26th degree of Aries, and then Saturn ruling up until the 30th degree of Aries. We know that those are the terms of Aries in general. And if you want to learn how to memorize the essential dignity table in the same way that I've memorized the essential dignity table and can recall that from my memory at any point in the day, then please make sure to buy yourself a copy of my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, which doesn't necessarily teach you how to memorize the essential dignity table. As far as I'm concerned, I'm probably the only one who can do that. However, this book does provide a lot of context for what you are going to be memorizing, so that you can draw this information from this book also from your brain as you will also draw the essential dignities table itself from your brain should you choose to study at the Oraculos School of Astrology. Now, when it comes to this idea of term/bound, planets don't necessarily have any major strength as a result of them being in that term/bound. However, when Venus is at 13 degrees of Aries, for example, Venus is in a spot where she has the ability to feel a little bit more like herself. Even though while in the entire sign of Aries, Venus is feeling very uncomfortable because Aries is the polar opposite of her domicile, which is Libra. Within that tiny lacuna, or within that tiny gap that we find in Aries, Venus has the ability to feel a sense of her own Venusian nature, even while she is in a state that fundamentally does not feel good for her. And then finally, when it comes to a planet in its term or face, in traditional astrology, we say that that planet is on its last gasp. We say that a planet in its own face is like a family at the end of its bloodline that knows that the last person who can carry that family's bloodline ahead is at the end of their own life. So there's a sense of desperation when we find the planet occupying its face. There's a sense of deep loneliness when we find a planet occupying its face. And especially if that's the only essential dignity that that planet has within that sign, there's a very real sense of anxiety, of anxiousness, and a sense of possibly ending up in a set of circumstances that feel utterly awful. Now, all of these interpretations have to be augmented or changed based on the specific type of astrology we find ourselves practicing. Essential dignity carries this exact same meaning that I've shared with you right now when we are practicing horary astrology. Maybe it also carries this exact type of meaning when we're practicing electional astrology. However, this idea of essential dignities and debilities, as well as this idea of each level of essential dignity or debility having a clear-cut definition, does not exist in the natal astrology world as it does within the horary astrology world or the electional astrology world. And potentially the reason for that is because we tend to live longer than any question we might ask. And as a result of that extended time, we have more time to figure out how to operate with these planetary potencies within our lives, whether those planets are strongly essentially dignified or whether those planets are very strongly essentially debilitated. Because we have an entire life within which to figure it out essentially, we don't necessarily have to figure it out on the spot. Whereas in horary astrology, a lot of our figuring out tends to be in that moment, in that spot. And in horary astrology, we tend to be asking about things that also are very temporal or based within that specific moment. So in horary astrology, the definitions that I've given for the essential dignities and debilities tends to be more strongly accurate than in natal astrology, because in natal astrology, our primary intention is to understand the planetary combinations that are occurring between the planets, regardless of whether or not those planets find themselves in a state of essential dignity or in a state of deep essential debility. If you've learned anything from this video today, you will definitely learn far more on this topic of essential dignity and debility by buying a copy of my book, Mastering Traditional Astrology, A Depth of Beginning in the Celestial Art. And you'll also learn a lot on this topic by studying with us in our upcoming Professional Astrologers Diploma program here at the Oraculos School of Astrology. Now, stay tuned because in our next video, we are going to be diving into yet another part of this series on traditional astrology.